Welcome to Wrath of the Lich King in Brief, the mini-series where we take a look at each spec by their role. As per usual, we'll be rating the classes based upon how well they perform in raids early on, how the specialization scales as the expansion goes on, complexity, how hard is this spec to pick up and play, stacking, will raids actively seek to bring more than one of them, the utility in terms of buffs and debuffs, and of course PvP. Ratings will be done from 1 to 5 stars, and here's what each star means. First up, Arcane Mage. This is going to be the go-to spec early for mages, offering very high levels of burst damage. In TBC, Arcane was surprising. It remained relevant from super early, and it still is right at the end of the expansion, but for Wrath it does feel like eventually it will begin to fall off and a different mage spec will become king. For complexity, Arcane is on the simpler side of things, always has been, except now you sometimes press Arcane Missiles when you get a proc. Other than that, it's Arcane Blast all day, every day. Stacking mages is quite performance dependent, as DPS is the main thing which they are offering, and despite Arcane being good early, I think some other specs will be outdoing it. You may see a few mages in the roster, but not to the point where they're stacked excessively. Utility-wise, we have the mage standard intellect, the situational amplify or dampen magics, and table. For Arcane, there's a new focus magic talent offering another member of the raid 3% crit, and of course the 3% raid-wide damage buff, Arcane Empowerment. On top of that, sometimes spell steal can be clutch too, so Arcane gets an average score here. In PvP, it has more going for it than TBC with more survivability focused talents, but Arcane is still very squishy. But if you do let it cast, you can certainly delete people. Fire is expected to overtake Arcane midway through the expansion, and by ICC should be well ahead. The age-old problem with Fire is that you need a lot of crit to really make it work, with talents such as Ignite and Hot Streak really pushing Fire to be one of the top caster DPS eventually, but just don't expect much from it early game. Fire, like Arcane, very straightforward to play. It's all about landing those two back-to-back crits and sending in an instant pyroblast. There are more arguments for stacking a few mages in your raid, but you can also do without, so I've given them an average score here. Utility-wise, again, similar place to Arcane, more about the damage, but they will still have focus magic and the ability to add 5% spell crit to the target, which is nice and all, but another class which I'd expect a lot more of to be doing this already. For PvP, it feels like we're talking about Arcane again, a lot of added survivability, but it's still squishy. Saying that, Dragon's Breath Disorient now lasts 5 seconds, and Blast Wave has a knockback added onto it, so you have a lot more control as this spec. It is a very fun spec and can see good results from skilled players. Frost Mage next, and it's just not a good story in PvE this expansion. It's one of the few specs which, I mean, go for it yourself one day and see how well it performs. Arcane exists for mages early, and Fire exists later. Frost just doesn't get a look in for raiding content, and even if it did, I'd still give it a 1 on complexity. Mage is literally the only class I've done this with thinking about it. On top of that, Frost doesn't have any special utility that the other specs don't do either, and I suppose this is because Frost is the PvP spec for mages this expansion. Frost has always been a spec that has control and burst, and in Wrath the likes of Deep Freeze is added for another huge stun and freeze effect, as well as Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze giving you more access to instant cast damaging spells. Expect to see a ton of Frost mages in arenas and battlegrounds during Wrath. On to the Laser Chicken, the Boomy, or more commonly known, the Balanced Druid. Few specializations in the game can match the burst AoE that the Boom King can put out with Starfall into Hurricane. Oh, and the cooldown from Hurricane has been totally removed, by the way. Just make sure you aren't pulling the whole room by accident with Starfall though. They start off with incredible AoE and respectable single target, and they also scale fairly well on top of that. Maybe I should have gone for a 3 for scaling, but I've seen some really good numbers from Boomkins late into ICC, so I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt here. For complexity, there's 2 main things which you are thinking about: proccing your Eclipse at the correct time, which will empower your main spells, and snapshotting as many effects as possible for your Starfall. It does seem all quite simple, but there are a few considerations that will set players apart here. In terms of stacking, well, you don't hate to see it, but I still think Boomies are in that 1 of specialization category, similar to how they were in TBC. Boomkin utility is even better than TBC with the Druid standard buffs in Innovate, Battle Res, and now they bring 3% haste, 5% spell crit, and 3% spell hit for your raid, making them more than just a great addition to about any team. In terms of PvP, whilst they have come a long way since TBC, offering much better damage and having more CC options, they still fall into that category of being quite easily shut down just by being hard focused, so I've given them an average score here. Elemental Shaman feels like a much more involved spec than it did in TBC, but in many ways it undergoes the same experience. Start of expansion, it looks great, able to push performance super well. By the end of the expansion, it's fallen down the meters somewhat. Elemental just doesn't scale too well, unfortunately, and Wrath really doesn't change that. The spec is also on the simple side to play, though now you have to make sure that you weave in a few lava bursts and that flame shock remains on the target all the time. Also, you have to flame shock before lava burst in Wrath. You can't do it when the spell is in mid-air. They changed it to work like that in retail a while ago. It was a simple rotational change, but it made Elemental feel so much better. The stacking, essentially, no. I mean, you can if it comes to it, but people won't be seeking out multiple Elemental Shamans for their roster. Utility-wise, they're actually really strong. Of course, bringing Heroes More Bloodlust, 5% spell crit, 3% flat crit, 5% spell haste, Totem of Wrath, which is a nice bump in spell damage, and more. It just tends to be the case that other classes, which are going to be more popular, have filled those requirements. Hard to bring the player, not the class at work here. PvP-wise, this spec is a complete monster, and for me is the top caster spec of the expansion, though only just narrowly. There's some very powerful classes out there. I want to say whatever level you PvP at, be it arena or casual battlegrounds or anything in between, Elemental is a great pick. Super high burst damage, good survivability, a hard CC in Hex, an interrupt from Wind Shear. This spec just got giga buffed from TBC. I'd say the most overall buff spec for PvP in the game. Beast Mastery Hunter, where did it all go wrong? One of the best single target PvE specs for the entirety of TBC, and then we get to Wrath and people don't want them in the raid anymore. The updates that Wrath brought for BM just didn't hit the mark this expansion for PvE. Even the new exotic pets failed to bring anything unique to the table other than saying, hey, look at me, I've got a dinosaur for a pet. It's a similar story to Frostmage. A better spec exists early and late in the expansion, leaving BM out. Beast Mastery doesn't even really find its footing too well in PvP either. I'd expect it to be played early on a little bit when resilience is low and it's part of the infamous Beast Cleave comp, but whilst it can put out some very big numbers in the opener, it's super lacking on the utility side of things. Marksman, however, is in a great spot for Wrath. It's solid enough early on to try it out and see if you're curious how well it will perform, but it really does need a bunch of armor penetration to start putting out the damage it's capable of. Expect most players to opt into the other spec we haven't talked about yet early on. As we progress on with gearing, Marksman is a late game machine which can absolutely blast crits non-stop and is super satisfying to play. So in terms of complexity, hunters need something to be said about them. In the Burning Crusade there was this thing called melee weaving. This was running into melee range in between auto shots to swing with your melee weapon. This worked because ranged and melee auto swings were tracked separately. In Wrath they are tracked together, which means you can't do this anymore. If melee weaving was in the game, hunters would have had the highest skill cap of any class by so far it's not even close. But since it's not, they are more average, with a more ability comes off cooldown, press ability type rotation. Though you do have a pet to manage too, and in Wrath, pets aren't always very smart, so an average score here. Utility, not too much that's special if I'm honest, but hunters have one of the most important abilities in the game. Misdirection. Pulling mobs that have just spawned on the other side of the room or just giving your tanks a huge threat lead is such a useful thing to be able to do. In PvP, this specialization has totally changed in the way that it plays from TBC, where you'd often focus on gradually wearing people down. Now for Wrath, aim shot is instant cast and still applies a mortal strike type effect. You have deterrence to help survivability. Master's Call is a hand of freedom type effect. You even have a disarm thanks to Chimera Shot. On top of that, Marksman puts out some nasty burst damage with their standard rotation of abilities coming up every so often. Expect plenty of hunters at high ranks in Arena during Wrath. Next, Survival. So we expect Survival to be the go-to hunter spec early on, and even saying that, I think people are sleeping on it a bit. The AoE this spec puts out is very impressive through a glyphed explosive trap, which allows the periodic effect to crit as well as volley. Their single target is pretty awesome at the same time. It's also worth a note at the moment Blizzard are considering buffing Ulduar gear, so Survival might remain the played hunter spec for a pretty sizable portion of the expansion. Later on, people will consider the reroll to Marksman when we get deep into the expansion, but I still think Survival will be decent. There's more going on with Survival than Marksman too, with you going into melee range to place traps to force certain procs, as well as making sure you don't clip your explosive shots. And of course, it's still a pet class. Utility-wise, it's good for all the same reasons that Marksman is, except you can generate much better AoE threats because your traps do a ton more damage. In PvP, it's not half bad either, offering good, consistent damage, but often lacking the utility that Marksman can bring. Shadow Priests have been putting up way better numbers than I thought they would in early raids. Shadow Form gets mega buffed, so now all of your dots crit and most of them benefit from haste, giving the priest access to much better damage as well as scaling. On top of that, you have Mind Seer, so when it's time to AoE, you aren't just sitting there feeling sad anymore. For scaling, they definitely improve as time goes on, but just not quite at the same rate as some other specializations do. I'd expect them to be more middle of the pack as we progress the expansion. Complexity is very similar to how Shadow has been just about forever. Maintain your damage over time effects, except you now have a new one in your kit, Devouring Plague. There will be some opportunities to snapshot Shadow Word Pain as Mind Flay will refresh its duration, but other than that, it does feel quite similar to how Shadow Priests have played for a long time though, just with a bit faster paced gameplay. Stacking wise, well, no, really, it's not something people will be looking to do, but you'll definitely want Shadow Priests as a one-off, but often not more than that. For utility, they're still good, but their role has totally changed here. Back in TBC, they were notorious as mana batteries. They restored thousands of mana back to their party over a fight. Now in Wrath, this mana regen effect is gone, and instead they have replenishment, and you need 2 people doing this for a 25-man raid to fully benefit. What they do bring that is unique is Dispersion, a 90% damage reduction. Anytime there is a big soaking mechanic, you just throw your Shadow Priest at it, and they're more or less guaranteed going to live. In PvP, this spec also gets majorly buffed with far better damage, CC, and survivability. They have a Disarm from Psychic Horror, the standard AoE Fear and Silence they've always had. Fade now removes slowing effects, and Dispersion will guarantee that you live something. And if Vampiric Touch is dispelled now, it'll hit the target back hard. If a Shadow Priest is given uptime on a target, their health bar just absolutely disappears. Very scary class to play against this expansion. You'll be seeing them a lot more than you did in TBC. Which leaves us with Warlock. Affliction first. What can I say? They start off very strong in tier 7 and just keep getting better and better. Affliction gets a very powerful execute phase added into Drain Soul, and with health bars being buffed in Nax by 30% and a planned pre-nerf Ulduar, that's setting them up very nicely. They continue to improve as the expansion goes on and should always be among the top DPS, perhaps until very late into the expansion when your melee start picking up Shadowmourne. At a base level of complexity, I'd say Affliction is fairly straightforward to get good results from. It's just maintaining a number of dots, pressing Haunt, and using your filler spell. You can however get very min-maxy with this spec, between snapshotting, weapon swapping for buffs, and so on. There is a lot of optimization to be done here. Stacking wise, Affliction will be the most stacked DPS specialization in the game for the majority of the game. They are just always good and add a huge amount of value to any raid team with their performance, which is fortunate because they don't really do all that much utility wise. The main benefits are just your Warlock standard soul and health stones. In PvP, the specialization is good too, though the most notable change from TBC is that Warlocks feel a lot more squishy and really need to make the most of Demonic Circle to stop melee from running them down, though Affliction remains a high pressure specialization, making the most of their damage over time effects. Next, Demonology. Hey, that's what I'm going to be playing. No bias though, I'll say what I really think about it. And early game, it's expected to be very good, offering amazing AoE burst and upper tier single target damage. Your Demon, which will be a Felguard, also really starts to do some noticeable damage in Wrath too. And that's another change I suppose I should mention. Warlocks will be using demons now. If you've been playing a lock in PvE since Classic, you nearly always sacrificed your demon or had an imp just standing there AFK in phase shift, because if they get hit by anything, they just fall over. The demonic sacrifice talent has also been completely removed from the game, so now we are actually a proper pet class. Scaling wise, Demonology won't be going up and up like Affliction will, and remains more consistent, even to the point of falling off just a little. Stacking wise, this could be interesting actually. Early on, it may be the case you just have all your Warlocks play Demonology if the spec is clearly outperforming Affliction, in which case they should be getting a 5 here, but Demo is typically seen as a one-of specialization, and that's what they'll become eventually, so that's why I've gone with this score. For utility, Demonology Warlocks have perhaps the single best buff in the entire game, and that is not an exaggeration. Demonic Pact gives your entire raid 10% of your spell power when your demon crits. This is kind of a big deal. No other class has a scaling buff. Blizzard have also implemented a quality of life change where a lower value buff cannot overlap a higher value one, meaning you don't have to mess about micromanaging your demon either, which is a super nice change. In PvP, you run in, you press Metamorphosis, you hope that things have gone well, because outside of that cooldown, you really don't have much going for you. Finally, Destruction Warlock. It's become less of a consideration for PvE than it was in TBC, but it's actually not half bad. Definitely not in the same category as BM Hunter or Frost Mage here. The question is, why would you play this when Affliction and Demonology exist? The answer is probably Chaos Bolt looks cool, and I can't argue with that. Give it a go on a farm raid one day, see what you think of it. It remains fairly consistent too throughout the expansion, but just isn't on the same level as the other two specializations. It's fairly simple to play too, though has a few more buttons than the TBC version of Destruction did, which, you know, isn't exactly a tall order. Stacking wise, I don't see a case where that would happen. The utility is also very standard Warlock offerings, nothing special to highlight here. PvP is where Destruction truly shines in Wrath, getting mega buffed compared to TBC. This specialization puts out some of the nastiest burst damage of any caster, and Chaos Bolt might work a little differently from what you remember too. It doesn't always crit in Wrath, instead it pierces barriers and cannot be resisted. At one point in Wrath it used to go through damage reduction effects and immunities as well, which, you know, got nerfed. As with the other Warlock specs in PvP, you are much more prone to getting rushed down than you currently are, so good positioning is key. And those are the casters for Wrath of the Lich King Classic, all done. A lot to look forwards to here. Every caster has a much more involved playstyle. Very few one-button simulators are left over from TBC, which I'm very happy about. A couple specs get incredibly well buffed in PvP content too. I've covered each class and specialization in a huge amount of detail for Wrath Classic. In fact, I've got a near 4-hour video on the channel containing an overview of each class, but I realized that's not going to be for everybody. So I thought, why not try and do a quick rundown of each spec by the category instead? I know some people prefer to play a certain role or want to give something new a try they've never seen before in the expansion. So here's an overview of what we'll be talking about and how things will be rated whilst I am discussing them. I wanted to pick something which made sense for every specialization in the game, whatever video it is, whether we're talking about tanks, heals or DPS, and to cover areas which take into account how Wrath of the Lich King is expected to work. I've split performance into early game and later game, or scaling, as many classes change in power as itemization is updated. We will then have the complexity of the specialization. How difficult is it to play on a baseline level? How stackable is it? Are you likely to bring more than one of them, or even 2 or 3? The utility, as in buffs or debuffs, and finally PvP, more concerning arena. Each area will be rated on 1 to 5 stars, and here is what each star means. So for example, 1-star scaling means the specialization falls off hard later in the expansion, 3-star means it stays quite consistent, and 5-star means it improves massively. I hope that makes sense. Let's make a start. I want to start off with a new hero class, the Death Knight. They have 2 DPS specializations, both of Frost and Unholy. Frost begins Wrath as a hard-hitting single-target spec with excellent AoE burst, although very proc dependent, and they don't require a ton of gear to really start pushing excellent damage, putting them as a strong contender for top DPS in early raids. As the expansion progresses though, they don't fall off and even begin to scale up with armor penetration gear in Trial of the Crusader and beyond. Playstyle wise, the Frost Death Knight is, I would say, on the simpler end of things. Apply your diseases, keep them up, and dish out huge crits through Killing Machine and Rhyme. Frost DK is a respect that you certainly don't mind seeing more than one of in your raid, but it doesn't feel super necessary either, so I've given them an average score for stacking. I really rate Death Knight utility in general. Frost in particular doesn't have the most utility overall, but the way it provides it is just super consistent, namely improved Icy Talons, giving your entire raid 20% melee haste. Other alternatives to get this buff just are not as good. PvP wise, sure it can hit hard, but it's ultimately overshadowed hard by its Unholy counterpart, which just does nearly everything better. Speaking of Unholy, that is next, and I have a feeling they are more on par with Frost than what I'm giving them credit for here. If boss fights are short enough, your Gargoyle and pets just do an absolutely dumb amount of damage during the opener. They certainly scale well too, favouring more strength over armor penetration. I'd say both Death Knight DPS specs start good and only get better. Not everyone can say that. Complexity wise, I think they have more going on than Frost does. Maintaining your Desolation buff for 5% damage, your Ghoul Frenzy uptime keeping diseases going, timing Gargoyle right with snapshotted buffs, and of course it's a pet class, don't forget that. One more thing, there's been a great deal of experimentation with dual wield Unholy instead of the more traditional two-handed spec. It could very well be the case that both DK DPS want two one-handers. Stacking Unholy feels similar to Frost, doesn't hurt, but often you won't be actively looking for it. Utility again here is something which I really rate. Unholy are something totally unique which almost wants to make me put it up to 5-star because it's so good, and that's Ebon Plaguebringer. This makes your diseases passively apply what is essentially Curse of Elements, causing 12% more magic damage taken. The other alternatives to apply this debuff are only single target, making Unholy DKs have a fantastic niche here. Finally, in the arena, this is a total monster of a specialization. At quite literally no point is it bad and finds itself in some of the strongest arena teams throughout Wrath. It's a utility and damage dealing machine. Next, Rogue. Assassination first. It very well may be the top performing single spec in the game early on in raiding content, needing next to no gear bar a couple of daggers. This class just gets so much power through its baseline talents and poisons. Its AoE is good too, but not top tier. Scaling wise, if Blizzard buffs all to our gear, which they very well might from a recent blue post, we could see Assassination Rogues do things we've never seen them do to DPS meters before in Wrath. If not, they are expected to remain consistently high, that is. As for how hard this spec is to play, I'm gonna say this is the easiest melee in the game. Slice and Dice is auto-refreshed thanks to talents, you press Mutilate, and then you Envenom. And yep, that's it. Very chill spec. Stacking rogues? Assassination, yeah, sure you could early. If you're gearing multiple rogues in your raid or you want them for later game content. As we progress though, well, we'll talk about that when we get to it. Utility-wise, rogues don't bring a huge amount, but Tricks of the Trade gets them more or less all of the credit for the score here, offering a great threat transfer and a damage buff. PvP, I mean, it's like how playing sub is in TBC. It's high pressure if it's given uptime, but it has less tools to maintain that uptime. Combat is also in a great spot for Wrath. Much like Assassination, it comes into early raids offering great damage, with a niche strength of cleave damage through Blade Flurry. It also has a powerful set of DPS cooldowns to blow through. The scaling on combat is also top tier. Combat benefits heavily from armor penetration gains that are offered in late game raid tiers, so it should start well and only get better as we go on. Much like Assassination, not the most complicated spec in the game. After your cooldowns are through, it's back to maintaining Slice and Dice and weaving in some finishes in between. It feels less attractive to stack combat early compared to Assassination, but the opposite can be said for later in the expansion, where multiple combat rogues can be a great choice. Utility also gets a pass thanks to Tricks of the Trade, though combat also brings the 4% physical damage taken debuff, which is more or less going to be the only specialization providing that late game. In PvP, you run in, you press all your cooldowns, and you hope you've won the game by then, because if you haven't, you're probably gonna lose. Sub Rogue, am I really covering sub here? I mean, I guess I am. Maybe, just maybe it's secretly overpowered, but nobody has figured out how to play it yet. Perhaps that's what it is. Or maybe it's just so bad in PvE there's nothing to really say about how it performs in raid content. I'd say if you're in BIS gear and want some 100 passes to put on your Tinder profile so you can call yourself a big pumper, that's more or less the only use for sub in PvE. PvP wise, completely different story of course. This is one of the most iconic PvP specs in the game, with your standard rogue suite of CC, burst and utility. In Wrath there's definitely a chasm between the viable PvP and PvE specs for rogue. For arms warriors, they should be the go-to DPS specialization for the class early in the expansion, but don't expect anything too great from them quite yet. A nice sweeping strikes into Bladestorm can certainly decimate on trash or AoE pulls, but the single target often leaves a lot to be desired. As the expansion progresses, sure they scale well with armor penetration, but at a certain point in time, every arms warrior will really want to be hitting that respec button and considering their other DPS spec. The specialization is also very simple to play in that you keep up your rend and you use your procs in sudden death and taste for blood as they come up. There's no need for a swing timer anymore because slams and regular auto attacks are tracked separately. In between that, Bladestorm away. It's simple, but it is satisfying, I have to say. Stacking wise, you don't need to, but chances are you're going to be gearing more than one warrior at some point in time for later in the expansion. Utility wise, they're pretty good actually, bringing the 4% physical damage debuff and a major armor reduction. expansion. Enjoy arguing between yourself and the rogue for literally the entire expansion as for who has to sunder. In PvP, I think arms is legitimately one of the strongest melee, if not the strongest melee in the game, with extremely high damage and pressure through Mortal Strike, decent mobility and much improved survivability compared to TBC, and as they gain armor penetration they only ever get better. Highly recommended for PvP enjoyers. Fury exceeded expectations in TBC, powerful far earlier than expected. For Wrath, I've seen the beta raids, and this time around surely it'll be the correct prediction that Fury will be way down on the meters during the start of the expansion. Scaling wise, there is quite literally nothing that compares to a Fury Warrior. Late game, they are absolute beasts with insane single target and AoE capabilities. They just need an absolute ton of gear to really come online. For stacking, well, it kind of goes without saying. Early game, no. Late game, yes. They need that Trial of the Crusader and beyond gear to be worth really stacking, because on top of that, the utility is kind of bad. They do bring a number of buffs, but nothing that's hard required or there isn't already another class doing it. In PvP, I don't know why you would really. Arms exist, play arms. Next, Feral DPS, a highly anticipated specialization for Wrath Classic I feel. Early on we expect them to perform well on single target with great burst on AoE. Their bleeds can crit now, and of course they bypass armor, making them a solid starter. They also scale well with armor penetration in later game raids due to a sizable portion of their damage still coming from the likes of auto attack and shred. However, despite being a good performer, the class is hard to play. In fact, I would say it's the most complicated spec in the game to play well, and if you aren't playing well, its performance suffers enormously. It's a juggling act of managing buffs and debuffs, and you really can't afford to drop anything. On top of that, you may have heard of the likes of power shifting in the past from the likes of Classic or TBC, and that is no longer a thing, thankfully. But Feral Druids, in their apparent endless quest to make the spec harder than it needs to be, have come up with something new called Bear Weaving, which is shifting into bear form when there's nothing that needs to be done in cat, and applying Lacerate and other abilities during that downtime. I semi-feel like this is a meme, but hey, if it's a DPS increase, then it's a DPS increase, and I just thought I'd mention it. You don't need to stack Ferals, it's more than likely going to be a one-off spec in your raid. The utility is good, you still bring that 5% crit buff, somebody has to do it after all, and the combat res never goes amiss either, giving them an average score here. I think they improve in PvP a lot compared to TBC. With each 5 combo points spent, their next spell, such as Cyclone, is instant cast, giving them a very high pressure and a large amount of CC for a melee spec. Next, Retribution Paladin. I see so many paladins out there leveling, it feels as though this is already a popular choice. Early game in raids, I see them being solid on AoE and middle of the pack on single target. They do deal a ton of their damage as holy though, bypassing armor, and Nax is full of undead, meaning spells such as Exorcism are always going to crit. The scaling for Ret is probably the only time where I'll put an asterisk next to it, as most of the time classes begin to take off in Trial of the Crusader. For Ret, however, it's a tier set bonus which they very specifically need, and that is the tier 10 2 set. This gives their auto attacks a 40% chance to reset the cooldown on Divine Storm. This is possibly the most powerful tier set bonus that has ever existed in Classic so far, and completely changes the power of the spec, albeit RNG heavy. Basically, don't expect to do super well until ICC. It is what it is. Ret is also very straightforward to play. It has a priority system of short cooldown abilities. You press them in the correct order when they come off cooldown. There's definitely some learning to be done there and making sure you're pressing the right button at the right time, but on a baseline level, Ret, very simple. For stacking Ret, I mean, maybe an ICC. Before that, you wouldn't exactly go looking for it. Ret is an absolute utility powerhouse, and I think they are one of the single best one-off additions you can make to any raid team. By themselves, they provide 7 separate buffs and debuffs. No other spec in the game comes close to this. On top of that, you can spec into Aura Mastery or even Divine Sacrifice for a raid-wide cooldown. They have Hand of Sacrifice, Hand of Protection, Hand of Freedom, Lay on Hands, and so much more. Sure, Ret is a bit easy to play, but you can really stand out by making the most of your huge toolkit of utility. PvP wise, I'd say they're again improved compared to TBC, but have a much different playstyle now. In TBC, it was all about proccing that Wind Fury and trying to global somebody. These days, Ret is a lot more consistent pressure with a strong amount of utility and CC in their toolkit as well. Finally, Enhancement Shaman. They come out the gates as a very impressive specialization for both single target and AoE encounters, dealing a good mix of physical and magical damage. Their scaling is a bit up in the air, if I'm honest. I've heard both sides of it, I've seen both sides of it, between they do amazing and they fall off, so I've decided to go down the middle with it. I think the scaling can be difficult to assess because the specialization is kind of hard to play well. Simply put, there's just a lot of different buttons you need to be managing between your cooldowns, your totems, your totem placement, and even pet management with Feral Spirit active, and if you drop the ball, your DPS can suffer fast. There is also an alternative playstyle for enhancement too, known as Spellhance, where you will use spell power jewelry, trinkets, and weapons. This variation focuses more of its damage into fire via the likes of Flame Tongue Weapon and Fire Nova. Typically, people won't look to stack enhancement either due to the fact that Shaman utility takes a huge hit moving from TBC to Wrath. Other classes can now do what they do, and often easier. However, I will say if a raid does not have a Shaman, they instantly become the best utility class in the game bar none. It doesn't even matter which spec you're playing at this point, because Heroism and Bloodlust are just too good not to have. In PvP, they can pack a serious amount of burst in the opener, applying high pressure with Feral Spirit, Heroism, and Purge, though they often need to score a takedown fairly fast, or they'll begin to get kited out. Welcome back to In Brief, a mini-series where I want to talk about each role in the game and break down the specializations which go into it. There'll be a playlist below with the other roles I've done so far, as well as much more in-depth videos about every single class and spec in the game. So if you see anything you want to hear more about, you can check that out below. Here's a quick breakdown of the points we'll be talking about for each spec today: how well they perform in raids early on, how well each specialization scales, how difficult they are to pick up and play on a fairly basic level. Will raids want to try and stack this particular spec, the utility they offer in terms of buffs and debuffs, and finally PvP. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5 stars, and here's what those stars mean. So today we have the healers in Wrath of the Lich King. First thing to mention before we get into it is across the board you're going to notice the later we go into the expansion, the more you kind of just turn into a turret which doesn't really have a mana bar to worry about anymore. Don't get me wrong, you can go in if you really try, but it's noticeable compared to TBC, and especially Classic. Also, the vast majority of spells have the same cost now at all ranks, so you can't cheese healing with down ranking and being efficient in that regard anymore. Overall, these are changes which make healing feel a lot more of an active role. On top of that, healers start to get even further defined into their niche of what kind of healing they provide. So with that said, we should make a start. Holy Paladin first, in quite a literal sense as well. This specialization is a complete monster, and is probably the closest to something getting a perfect score. They start off as arguably the strongest healer in the game, and just never let go of that claim either. With amazing mana efficiency, Avenging Wrath now grants 30% bonus heals in addition to damage, a much lower cooldown on Holy Shock, the Holy Paladin feels great to play. In the past, it's often been seen as the single target healer. However, now it's more of a cleave healer thanks to Beacon of Light copying their heals to a second target. Holy Paladins also do a huge amount of passive healing through the likes of Glyph of Holy Light and Judgment of Light. As the expansion progresses, they just keep getting better and better as gear improves. Realistically, you could expect the Holy Paladin to be the top healer from day one to the very end. They are just that good. Holy Paladins have often been seen as super easy to play though, a literal one-button class, which gives you good results but not in the most interesting of ways. For Wrath, this also changes up as well. You need to maintain your Judgment of the Pure buff, keep your Beacon active, you have a shorter cooldown on Holy Shock, and you just have generally more buttons which you care about. And now that healing power has just been converted to spell power, you have more reasons to fill in and do some actual damage during downtime as well. In terms of stacking, Holy Paladin will be the healer that is stacked, as in guilds will actively seek out to have more than one of them on their roster. Now you don't need as many Holy Paladins as you did Shaman for TBC, but they are very much wanted and often more than one of them. This isn't true for any other healer, so I had to give them top marks here. Paladin utility is excellent, and that's without even taking the spec into consideration. As per usual, they have their abilities such as Hand of Protection, Freedom, Sacrifice, Salvation, Lay on Hands, the talented Divine Guardian for a raid-wide 20% damage reduction, and Aura Mastery. Yeah, they're good. They're really good. They are also arguably the best healer in PvP as well, having the same incredible set of utility in their kit, a ton of CC protection through sharing damage with Divine Guardian and Hand of Sacrifice, Sacred Cleansing to tilt casters into oblivion, a far better on the move toolkit through Holy Shock, Sacred Shield, various procs and so on. Out in the world at the moment I am seeing so much Paladin, and I'm hoping a fair amount of them want to give Holy a try because it really is worth it. Next, the Discipline Priest. So this specialization was kind of used in TBC. It had improved Divine Spirit, Power Infusion and Pain Suppression that were all certainly nice, but it wasn't so much of a dedicated healer as it was a support class. This changes in Wrath, and it changes a lot. Early on you'll definitely have guilds after a Disc Priest for the roster. They start the expansion as a strong healer, and as they gradually scale up and get more gear, they improve by a lot. Seeing the best results on Disc is kind of fight dependent though. The way Discipline heals is completely different to anyone else. Other healers have damage happen and then they restore it. Disc stops damage from ever happening in the first place, and that's done through power word shield spam, which believe me, you're going to be spamming a lot if you play this spec. This unique way of healing makes Disc fill a niche that literally no one else can do. However, they are definitely on the simpler side of things for healers. It really is going to be a lot of shield spam. Between that you have the new End of Tantry abilities in Penance and the standard access to good AoE heals that priests always do. In terms of stacking, put it like this, you may not always want a second of any other healer, but it's generally fine if you do. You kinda only ever want one Disc Priest and only one. Since they heal mainly through power word shield, that means they're also spamming the weakened soul debuff on people. So if you have a second Disc Priest, well, they can't use their main spell on that person. They just really step on each other's toes, and they don't heal in a way which synergizes well with each other at all. Disc Priest does pack a lot of utility though, scoring them pretty high in this regard, with the obvious stamina and spirit buff, power infusion to improve the performance of a caster, as well as pain suppression to more or less ensure that one person is guaranteed to live for 8 seconds. The renewed hope talent towards the bottom of the tree also grants their party or raid a flat 3% less damage taken too, which is easy to miss out but not a bad effect. In PvP, Discipline continues to be the go-to priest spec and is arguably in an even stronger place than TBC, where it's already a top tier pick. In Wrath they have even greater access to burst through talent changes, and Holy Fire having its cast time greatly reduced. Penance is another excellent offensive or defensive tool. A few crits on this will take somebody from near dead to near full health. It really is that good. So I guess it makes sense to talk about the other priest healing spec now, Holy. Honestly, it feels as though each expansion so far, Holy has seen the competition from other healers just grow and grow. And as a general point, many raids will certainly search out a Discipline Priest, and though Holy heals in a much different way to it, it's just not as commonly brought or sought out. Other healers on the roster kind of fill in what it does already, that being a lot of healing. Saying that Holy Priest does work in Wrath, it's just a case of there are other options. They both start and scale relatively well, with arguably the most diverse toolkit of any healer in Wrath, being able to talent and glyph into being more single target focused or going full in on AoE heals through Circle and Prayer of Healing. And I would say there is more to playing a Holy Priest well compared to Disc, or many other healers for that matter. With such a huge toolkit of heals, you will see people who are good at Holy Priest actually putting up some very impressive numbers, whilst those who know the fights a little bit less well will make it look quite average. Stacking wise, I wouldn't expect it to happen. There are more reasons to bring more Holy Priest than Disc, because they don't heal through shield spamming, but realistically it's not something you'll be seeing. The utility is just less than Disc as well. The big cooldown they have to offer is Guardian Spirit, which can be glyphed to have a shorter cooldown if the target lives while the buff is active, but it's by no means a necessary addition for raids. In PvP, well, it feels like this has been the summary for Holy so far. Discipline exists. Holy is mega squishy in PvP, and once again just doesn't have the utility that the other healing spec does. Definitely give Holy Priest a try at some point if you're a priest main in Wrath. It's a fun spec, but you'll probably see why most people opt into Discipline instead. Druid next. Once again, I feel as though I have to score the middle of the pack for early raids and scaling, and it's not entirely their fault, it's just kind of Disc Priest and Holy Paladin exist. And with the Holy Paladin doing insane passive healing and Disc making it so damage doesn't happen in the first place, that's not always the best when you're focused around providing heals over time. Raids will bring Resto Druids all the same though. In terms of complexity of playing the spec, Resto Druid is all about knowing the fight in advance and how the damage patterns happen. You need your hops rolling before the health bars start to dip, not after, and that's not always entirely predictable, but it's what will separate out the good Resto Druids from the great ones. For stacking, well, in short, no. Healing over time is good, but you need some direct heals in the balance there too for a well-rounded comp. I wouldn't expect many guilds to seek out more than one Resto Druid per roster. The utility is solid, nothing too crazy, standard offerings from the Druid here, your Innovate, your Battle Res and so on. Oh, also they get an out of combat res as well, that's quite a nice addition. They also give a raid-wide 6% healing buff from Tree Form, as well as a unique talent, Revitalize, which gives some of your heals over time a chance to restore resources based on what the recipient uses. In PvP, Druid gets nerfed compared to TBC, and it's still an amazing pick. I think this says more about the state of Druid in TBC than Wrath, to be honest. It's still up there in a number of very powerful comps, though it won't be what you're facing every second game anymore. Though it still has a lot going for it, great mobility through shapeshifting, a ton of on-the-move spells, and the likes of Cyclone, Roots and Bash. Finally, Restoration Shaman. So you know how a bit of a problem for Resto Druid was Discipline and Holy Palace existing? Yep, it's kind of the same story here. Also, Resto Shaman is way less of a desirable spec compared to how it was in TBC. Back during that expansion, you would stack them in every group where possible, or any shaman for that matter. You would want their totems, and Heroism and Bloodlust were only group-wide then. With it now being raid-wide and other classes being able to do what totems do, it leaves the Resto Shaman in a bit of a weird spot. Saying that, they can definitely perform really well and have been given a lot of help on the mana efficiency side of things, and it's not a weak specialization by any stretch of the imagination, and many raids will certainly opt into bringing a Resto Shaman for their team. Also, by the time you get to late game gearing, Resto Shamans are incredibly powerful. Complexity wise, well, you got on very good terms with Chain Heal during TBC. Now there is some more variation through Riptide and the Tidal Waves talent encouraging you to press other buttons, but yeah, it's still a lot of Chain Heal. It's just a good spell, who knew? Stacking wise for Resto Shamans, well no, people won't exactly be looking for that to happen, but it's not the worst if it does. Utility, as discussed earlier, Shamans took a hit here as a class, regardless of which spec we're talking about. They still have the 5% spell haste totem to consider though, and without a Shaman at all, your raid team suffers massively because raiding without Hero or Bloodlust is a very sad time. They also have one of the few group-wide buffs left in the game in Mana Tide Totem, restoring a ton of mana to their party over 12 seconds. Will healers really need that mana as we go further into the expansion though? Or will it just be the Arcane Mage begging for you to drop it? Probably the latter, but still it's a bit of unique utility though. In PvP, I think Resto Shaman gets mega buffed compared to TBC and finds itself as a centerpiece for some very high pressure comps. They get some fantastic quality of life such as one button to drop all 4 totems, Dispelling Earthshield will now remove stacks instead of the entire buff, Heroism is still usable in Arena, they have more on the move heals, an interrupt with Wind Shear, a CC with Hex, and more. Resto Shamans are in a great spot for Wrath. Welcome back to In Brief, and today it should be a relatively brief one as we're talking about the tanking role in Wrath Classic, and we only have 4 specializations to cover. In fact, it was only 3 before Wrath happened. Anyways, we will be rating each spec based upon how well they are expected to perform early, how well they scale as content will be released in the future, the complexity, is this spec hard to get good results from, stacking, will raids actively seek to bring more than one of this spec, the utility, including buffs, debuffs and so on, and finally PvP in the arena. Ratings will be done from 1 to 5 stars, and here's what each of those mean. So quick note for all tanks here is that threat generation is much improved in Wrath, especially compared to Classic, but also TBC. The baseline threat modifiers you get from your tank stance like Frost Presence, Righteous Fury and so on have been boosted up a fair bit, as well as nearly every spec getting access to better single target and AoE threat. Also your hunters with misdirection and rogues with tricks of the trade can play a huge part in threat too. Each of those abilities only have a 30-second cooldown, so they better be making the most of that. With that said, let's begin. First up is the Protection Paladin, and I feel as though I can say without a doubt this is the go-to main tank for the expansion. Classic had Warriors, TBC had the Feral Druid, in Wrath, the baton has been passed to the Paladin. They begin the expansion as an absolutely core foundation tank and just never let go of that role as long as they exist. Their gearing is a little updated from TBC 2. No longer will you be looking for plate with spell power on. Instead, now strength will be converted to spell power through a new talent. They have both very good, though not quite the best, abilities to generate threat on single target and AoE. Though if I'm honest, once the Paladins pick something up, you really have to try and over aggro at that point. Saying that, Naxxramas and ICC are full of undead, and an updated Holy Wrath, which is instant cast, generates so much threat on the pull that Paladins are quite self-sufficient here. You now also have a single target taunt in Hand of Reckoning, in addition to Righteous Defense back from TBC, which still taunts up to 3 targets, and they don't even share a cooldown. You also have a much more active playstyle. TBC was kind of Holy Shield, Consecration, and then just look fancy in the meantime. Now you have Avenger's Shield being instant cast, which makes it actually worth using in combat, Shield of the Righteous, a new hard-hitting single target ability, and Hammer of the Righteous for a mix of single target and AoE. Overall, for performance, Prot Pala is just in such a super stacked state that you should expect them to be very popular in this expansion. They're also fairly straightforward to get good results from. As with any role or spec, there is optimization to be done here, but running into a pack and doing so much AoE threat and single target at the same time with your core rotation makes them a simple tank to get good results from. They also don't have nearly as many defensive cooldowns as other tanks too, and get a ton of passive mitigation through their talents. Stacking wise, if there is a single tank which at any point guilds may realistically want more than one of per roster, it is the Prot Paladin. Utility, as per usual with the Paladin, is amazing, with a variety of defensive and offensive buffs. Specific to the protection tree is Divine Guardian, that being a raid-wide 20% damage reduction, as well as Avenger's Shield, now having a silence added onto it, making pulling caster mobs much easier. Oh, and you can't miss out talking about Ardent Defender. This is more or less Rogue's cheat death on a tank. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I don't know how this made it into the game. Any other tank dying at a bad time can more or less instantly wipe you due to follow-up player loss or uncontrolled boss mechanics. Not the Paladin. Finally, protection, as in deep protection, is actually reasonable in PvP as well, having incredible survivability because, you know, it's a tank, respectable damage, a stun through Hammer of Justice, and a silence on Avenger's Shield. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a few of them in arena-based content. Next up, Protection Warrior. So Protection gets a fairly poor reputation in Wrath, actually, but they can certainly do some things which other tanks can't. It's just for raiding the majority of the time, you only need a couple tanks, which makes those choices very important, and people trend towards picking what is the best. That being said, all content will definitely be cleared with Prot Warriors. Perhaps though it won't be quite as smooth of a ride as it could have been with other tanks, just be aware of that. On the positive side for Warriors in terms of early game performance and scaling is that their AoE threat is just unmatched. Prot Warriors are without a doubt the best dungeon tank in the game. Yes, better than Prot Paladins. I know that's kind of weird to say seeing how things are in TBC at the moment. Revenge auto cleaves for a ton of damage. Shockwave hits hard, stuns and is on a short cooldown. You can glyph cleave to hit an extra target. Thunderclap really does damage now. And more importantly, its target cap has been removed and it can crit. So when you spec into deep wounds in the arms tree, you thunderclap and it crits on targets, you're generating an absolutely enormous amount of AoE threat. This takes Warrior on AoE from having to sweat and tab spam Devastate to run in, press thunderclap and shockwave, and that's the AoE sorted. Next pack, please. Also, Blizzard are planning to buff dungeon content later in Wrath to keep it more relevant as time goes on. That is only ever a good thing for Prot Warriors who excel in this area of content. So that is good and all. What are the negatives? Well, the reason they're the best in dungeons is due to their AoE threat, and their single target is still good enough. The problem is in raids, some bosses hit rather hard, and Prot Warriors kind of missed the memo about survivability this expansion and went all in on damage. Seriously, why do so many of the core Prot Warrior talents only increase their damage? Shield block was also changed from a short cooldown ability to a much more longer one too, leaving warriors in a place where they often take more damage spikes than other tanks would. I put the complexity up a bit too because of this. Prot Warriors need to be a little more on the ball with planning cooldowns and keeping all their abilities rolling at the same time. In dungeons it's pretty simple, you just spam your AoE and don't have to worry too much, but in raids things can get a bit tricky. Stacking isn't likely to happen, not only because, well, there's just not many reasons reasons to be honest, but an important part of Prot Warrior's threat generation is not only dealing damage, but taking damage to generate rage. They kind of need to main tank, and that means you're competing with Prot Paladin, which in Wrath is a pretty difficult thing to do. Utility is good, however. They are the most mobile tank, being able to charge, intercept, or intervene without having to leave defensive stance thanks to a new talent. They have improved Thunderclap, Demo Shout, Sunder, Vigilance to reduce damage taken on a raid member and increase your threat a little bit. You can talent into a Blanket Silence on your Interrupt and Heroic Throw. You have an AoE stun in Shockwave, a single target stun in Concussive Blow, and Shield Wall has been lowered to a 5-minute cooldown and reduces damage by 60%. Which is still the best on-demand tank cooldown in the game by a long way. They also have a Disarm and Spell Reflect, I might as well just mention those too. So yes, warriors have a lot of buttons to press and a lot of utility. Prot warriors are also quite good in PvP for the reasons I just went over. They have a ton of utility and situational spells. They can also deal some very surprising burst damage for a tank. Later game, when you have more access to armor penetration, you're going to see Prot warriors global people with their shield slam. Next, the Blood Death Knight. So if Prot Pala's going to be the most common main tank, Blood will be the most common off tank. I wouldn't be surprised if most raids opt for this tanking lineup. Now, with this being the Wrath Death Knight, the tanking spec doesn't have a defined role as it did in Cataclysm and beyond, to strictly only being Blood. Frost or even Unholy tanking isn't even that bad, maybe for dungeon content that is. For raids, you'll be thinking about dropping quite a few points into Blood. Blood DK both begins the expansion strong and continue to get better as time goes on. What I like about Blood in Wrath is the degree of self-sufficiency as a tank that they have. The way that Blood tanks is way ahead of its time in terms of design. In expansions that came later, other tanks would go on to explore more active mitigation similar to the Blood DK. This is because Blood has tons of options to heal themselves. Other tanks take damage, they sometimes have access to defensive abilities, but healers need to top them up. Blood DKs can just straight up live by themselves for a long time. Blood also boasts the best single target threat generation in the game bar none. In a later patch in Wrath, Blizzard added a huge threat modifier to Icy Touch, making it more or less a spammable ranged taunt. Their AoE threat is good, but needs some time to ramp up a little through diseases, death and decay, and blood boil. I've also given a bit of a higher complexity rating, because Blood, like Prot warriors, have a lot of buttons to press. On a baseline level, pressing Icy Touch and never having to worry about threat is, yeah, pretty easy. But I'd say there's definitely more to it though. Making sure you have runes appropriate to what you're going to be pulling, going into AoE and not having any runes is a disaster waiting to happen. Blood also has tons and tons of cooldowns. Icebound Fortitude, Anti-Magic Shell, Blood Tap, Empower Rune Weapon, Vampiric Blood, Rune Tap, and managing all of those will separate Blood DKs that constantly take spiky damage and those that know what they will need and for when. For stacking them, it's not even bad if you have more than one, but will people actively seek out more than one per roster? I don't see it happening. Blood DK is a utility powerhouse. This is a big part of the reason why they fill the off-tank role so well. They can spec into two important raid buffs, those being 10% attack power and 20% melee haste. They have a combat res, a silence and strangulate, death grip to quickly reposition any mob right into the death ball, and unholy frenzy to significantly buff one of your physical damage dealers. This makes Blood very valuable whether they are actively tanking or not. As for PvP, they are very annoying, but they don't really do any damage to pose an actual threat. They do take forever to deal with though, so you'll probably see a few in Battlegrounds. Which means finally we have the Feral tanks. They were super powerful throughout the whole of TBC. How are things in Wrath? Well, they're not as good, if I'm being honest. It's a similar situation to what I said about Warriors though. People will clear the content with this spec, it'll just be not as easy as with other options. They start off having a rougher time than other tanks do, and the problem isn't necessarily down to survivability. Bears have always been known for having huge health bars, and that remains true in Wrath. It's all about the threat generation. Both on single target and AoE, it's just weaker than what other tanks are able to pull off. Every single other tank got new buttons to press in both scenarios. Ferals are still over here mangling and swiping. In fact, swipe is all they really have going for them on consistent AoE. Sure, you can press Berserk, which makes them god tier on 3 targets when that's up, but that's your big 3-minute cooldown. cooldown. For AoE, bears feel like they are just missing something and needed another button to press here. They do scale up quite well in terms of survivability though, and if you can say one thing about feral tanks is that at least their damage intake is more consistent than others, and they have powerful cooldowns in bark skin and survival instincts. Complexity wise, I've gone for an average score here. The reason why is because despite single target being very simple to pull off, on AoE you're going to have to be spamming swipe and then tabbing between targets and mauling or mangling, kind of like how a prot warrior plays in TBC at the moment. So I think it kind of goes without saying, but you won't exactly be looking to stack feral tanks either. On utility, they have a number of things going for them. Your standard druid innovate, battle res, 5% physical crit, 30% bleed damage, the 20% attack speed debuff, and more, which sounds nice, but chances are that another class is already doing one of these and has an easier time doing them. Also, feral cat DPS can do most of those things too as standard gameplay. Feral tank also for the most part competes for the off-tank spot with blood DKs, who can just do more if I'm being honest. The one saving grace that feral can do better than any other off-tank is actually contribute some damage to the raid themselves. But different from TBC, there are more talents tailored towards actually focusing your spec into a tank or a DPS in Wrath, and you being a tank are missing some of the vital talents that add to feral DPS. On the PvP side of things, if we're talking about feral in terms of being a tank and sitting in burr form, just no, they don't do any damage. They have less CC than cat. There's a whole list of reasons why this isn't a thing. If you see feral in PvP, they'll be playing cat and using burr form as a defensive cooldown. And that is all of the tanks covered. Again, those are my impressions of the specializations, with trying to keep things realistic. People will definitely clear all the content with all 4 of these specs, just some of them have a bit more going for them. That's everything though. Thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.